Summertime is always beautiful on the island of Sodor. The water sparkles in the sun, and beautiful flowers blossom everywhere. It's a busy time for all the engines. They collect lots of vacationers from the docks and show them all the splendid sights. James shows them the seaside. Emily shows them the windmill. And Thomas shows them the Sodor suspension bridge. The bridge is one of the vacationers' favorite sights. And each night, when the work is done, Gordon, Henry, James, Edward, Percy, and Thomas go back to their home at Tidmouth Sheds. The sheds are where they rest their wheels, cool their boilers, and talk about their day's adventures. The sheds are the engine's home. They are warm and snug. And most of all, they are a cozy place to sleep. One morning, Sir Topham Hatt came to Tidmouth Sheds. He had a very important announcement to make. He told the engines proudly. The engines were very excited. Percy puffed. Chuffed Thomas. Thomas and Percy arrived at the airport building site. They were bringing bricks and timber to the builders. Chuffed Thomas. Puffed Percy. But then Harry and Bert arrived. Mumbled Harry. Grumbled Bert. This made Thomas and Percy cross. They didn't want to work near the diesels either. The diesels were oily, and they were very different from the steamies. Can you see what is different about steam engines and diesel engines? Thomas is a steam engine. He runs on coal. Now here are Harry and Bert. Do they run on coal? No. They run on diesel fuel. Not like steam engines at all. When Thomas stops, he wheezes steam. Do Harry and Bert wheeze steam? No. Diesels don't make steam, but sometimes they make nasty black smoke. Did you hear that? That's Thomas's whistle. All steam engines have whistles. But what was that noise? It was Harry and Bert honking their horns. Diesel engines don't have whistles. They have horns instead. Steam engines and diesel engines really are very different. Thomas had a very busy day. That afternoon, he had to collect some timber from the yard. But when Thomas arrived, Harry and Bert were already there. Their freight cars were being loaded with planks of wood, ready to take to the building site. Boasted Bert. Added Harry. Thomas was cross. But then he had an idea. A very naughty idea. Thomas rolled quietly up behind Bert's freight cars. And just as the crane dropped the timber, he gave them an extra big shunt. Laughed Thomas. And he puffed away. Later, Thomas and Percy were shunting freight cars in the yard. They were having a wonderful time. They were bumping freight cars and blowing their whistles. Then, Diesel rolled into the yard. Oiled Diesel. Thomas had another naughty idea. Diesel is waiting to be coupled to a freight car. He is collecting supplies for the building site. There are 3 freight cars. One is full of bricks, one is full of timber, and one is full of bananas. Thomas wants to play a trick on Diesel. Can you help him? One of these freight cars is the wrong freight car to take to the building site. Do you know which one it is? Is it the freight car full of bricks? No. Bricks are very useful for building. They are used to build walls. If Thomas gave Diesel the freight car full of bricks, he would not be playing a trick. What about the freight car full of timber? Is that the wrong freight car to take to the building site? No. Timber is very useful too. It is used for building roofs. Timber isn't right for playing a trick on Diesel either. What about the freight car full of bananas? Can you build with bananas? No. Bananas are perfect for playing a trick on Diesel. They are no good for building at all. Although they are very nice to eat. Thomas and Percy were having great fun. Next, Thomas and Percy had to go to the smelter's yard. They were going to collect some steel girders. But when they puffed into the yard, they saw something that was very, very frightening. It was Diesel 10. Diesel 10 was big and strong, and he had a crushing, crunching claw. Thomas and Percy watched as the giant claw crushed the iron and steel. Thomas and Percy shivered. They thought Diesel 10 looked very scary. Thomas puffed nervously, and they raced away. That evening, Thomas and Percy were puffing happily back to the sheds. They couldn't wait to rest their wheels and talk to their friends about their day's adventures. But as they puffed home, they were very surprised. Puffed Percy. Wheezed Thomas. And when they arrived at Tidmouth Sheds, they discovered that they had been knocked down. Cried Thomas. Oiled Diesel. Sir Topham had added, the steam engines were cross with the diesel engines. The diesels had ruined their home. But Thomas was sad. He knew it was his fault. Moaned Henry. They soon found out. The engines puffed across the island. That night, they each had to sleep somewhere else. James had to stay at the dirty, dusty coaling plant. Moaned James. Edward had to stay at the quarry. Oiled Diesel. Percy and Henry had to stay at the smelter's yard. Moaned Henry. And poor Gordon had to sleep under a tent. He huffed. Only Toby was warm and snug in his cozy shed. He would have gladly shared his home with the other engines, but it was much too small. Thomas felt bad. There were lots of jobs that hadn't been finished, and it was all his fault. Now he had to stay at Knapford's sheds with Emily. Moaned Thomas. Emily huffed. Emily didn't like sharing her shed. She was used to peace and quiet. Puffed Thomas. But that night, a fierce storm swept through the island. It was the strongest wind the engines had ever known. It blustered and blew. The wind howled down the tracks and tore down the trees. It ripped off roofs and flattened fences. It even blew Gordon's tent away. Huffed Gordon. The other engines were glad to be tucked in for the night, but they were worried. Percy shivered. The wind blew all night long. The Sodor suspension bridge twisted and shook in the strong winds. And then there was trouble. The next morning, when Thomas puffed out of the sheds, he saw the storm had done lots of damage. He cried. Thomas puffed across the island. He could see the storm damage all around him. The airport building site was a complete mess. But when Thomas saw that the Sodor suspension bridge had collapsed, he felt worse than ever. That morning, Sir Topham Hatt came to see the engines. He was very upset. He said sadly, "Yes, sir," puffed the engines. Sir Topham Hatt added, "Peep Percy." Sir Topham Hatt said firmly, "There are lots of jobs to be done. Can you help Sir Topham Hatt decide where each engine should go? Harvey has his crane arm. Edward and Henry have freight cars full of bricks and timber. And Thomas has his passenger coaches, Annie and Clarabelle. These tracks are blocked by fallen trees. Which engine do you think can help? Edward and Henry? No. Freight cars full of bricks and timber won't move fallen trees. What about Thomas? No, passenger coaches won't move fallen trees either. What about Harvey? Yes, Harvey's crane arm will be perfect for moving fallen trees. Thank you, Harvey. But look at the airport terminal. These buildings will need to be repaired with bricks and timber. Which engine could help? Thomas? No, there are no bricks and timber in Annie and Clarabelle. Do you think Edward and Henry could help? Yes, that's right. Edward and Henry have lots of bricks and timber. Thank you, Edward and Henry. These workmen need to get to the Sodor suspension bridge. Which engine do you think can help them? What about Thomas? Yes, the workmen can climb aboard Annie and Clarabelle. Then Thomas can take them to the Sodor suspension bridge. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, everyone. Thomas arrived at the bridge with all the workmen, but Diesel was already there. Oiled Diesel, huffed Thomas. Harvey cleared the tracks, but Harry and Bert didn't talk to him. Harry grumbled. Edward and Henry brought bricks to the airport building site, and they didn't talk to Diesel either. Edward pouted. The Diesels weren't talking to the steam engines, and the steam engines weren't talking to the Diesels. They were all cross. Later, Thomas came across Diesel 10 again. Diesel 10 was helping to clear the blocked tracks. His giant claw lifted the heavy metal into freight cars. Thomas chuffed nervously. Thomas puffed quickly away. He didn't want to be near Diesel 10, or his crushing, crunching claw. That night at Knapford Sheds, Thomas started talking again. He told Emily all about Diesel 10, and all about his day's work. Wheezed Emily. She just wanted peace and quiet. But when Thomas fell asleep, he started to sleep whistle. It kept Emily awake. Emily really wished Thomas could go back to Tidmouth Sheds. The next morning, Sir Topham Hatt came to see Thomas. Sir Topham Hatt said, puffed Thomas. Sir Topham Hatt added, oiled Diesel. Thomas huffed crossly. But when Thomas arrived at the docks, he was worried. The bridge section was very long, and it was very, very heavy. Thomas pushed and puffed. He huffed and he chuffed. At last, his heavy load started to move. Thomas puffed slowly up the line. His pistons pumped and his axles ached. His load was very long and very heavy. Thomas is taking the bridge section to the Sodor suspension bridge. There are 3 ways to get there, but Thomas doesn't know which is the easiest way to go. Can you help him? This way looks quite short, but there is a steep hill in the middle. Do you think Thomas should go this way with his heavy load? It will be very difficult to push that heavy load up a steep hill. Is there an easier way for Thomas to go? This way looks quite short too, but there is a very sharp bend in the track. Do you think Thomas should go this way with his very long load? You're right. The bridge section is too long to go around that bend. Is there an easier way for Thomas to go? The last way is longer than the other 2, but there are no hills and no sharp bends. Do you think Thomas should go this way? That's right. This is the way that Thomas should go. Well done, Thomas. Thomas puffed slowly up to the bridge. The workman cried. Thomas was pleased to be there. He was looking forward to a rest, but there was another job to be done. The bridge section needed to be lowered into place. Diesel oiled. The foreman said. Thomas was very proud. Diesel was cross. The workman attached lots of cables to Thomas. Thomas slowly took up the strain, but the section was heavy. His wheels slipped. The workmen were worried. Thomas puffed harder and harder and held the beam steady. He edged forward, slowly lowering the section. It got heavier and heavier. Thomas had to work very hard to hold the section steady, until finally it was lowered into place. The workmen cheered. Called one of the workmen. Called another. Thomas was as tired as he had ever been, but he was so proud he felt like his boiler would burst. Boasted Thomas. This made Diesel crosser than ever. That afternoon, Thomas had to collect some paint for the bridge. Thomas puffed into the yard and backed up to the paint freight cars. But Diesel was in the yard too. Diesel whispered. He gave the freight cars an extra hard shunt. Paint cans flew into the air and splattered down all over Thomas. There was green paint, yellow paint, and red paint. Thomas looked very silly indeed. Laughed Diesel, and he rolled away. Puffed Thomas. So the next time Thomas saw Ari, he gave him a biff. And when Ari saw James, he gave him a bump. Soon the Diesels and Steamies were biffing and banging and being bumped all over the island. The engines were in a terrible mess. Everyone needed a good washdown, and no work had been done. That evening, Sir Topham Hatt came to see the engines. Sir Topham Hatt said, and all the engines were sad. Moaned Thomas. Groaned Percy. Huffed Emily. All the engines were miserable. And that night, they dreamed about what might happen to them if no vacationers came to Sodor. The engines were all very worried that they wouldn't be useful anymore. James was dreaming about the fairground. James dreamt he was a carnival game. Lots of children were lining up, and so was Sir Topham Hatt. The children threw lots of balls at James, and one of them even knocked the coconut out of his funnel. Groaned James. But it wasn't only James who was having a bad dream. Gordon was having a bad dream too. Gordon dreamt he was put in a playground. Children were swinging on him. They slid down his slide, and they climbed all over him. Huffed Gordon. Edward dreamt he was a scarecrow. He sat in a field up to his axles in mud, and Farmer McColl didn't seem to care. But Percy had the worst dream of all. He dreamt he was a roller coaster ride. He rattled up the rickety rails and all the way down again, wailed Percy. As the dawn began to break, Thomas was dreaming too. In his dream, he was wondering how he could make things better. As he wondered, Thomas puffed along a misty mountain track. And there was Lady. Lady was a very special steam engine. She worked high up in the mountains. Lady was shunting freight cars with Rusty the diesel engine. Thomas was surprised. Puffed Lady. The next morning, when Thomas woke up, he knew exactly what to do. Thomas puffed across the island. He was looking for Mavis. Mavis wasn't like the other diesel engines. She was kind. And Thomas knew she would help him with his plan. Thomas needs to find Mavis quickly. But he doesn't know where she is. How can Thomas find Mavis? Mavis's horn doesn't sound like anyone else's. Perhaps that will help Thomas to find her. Will you help Thomas listen for Mavis's horn? Thomas is wondering where to look first. Where does Mavis work? That's right, the quarry. Let's listen with Thomas and see if Mavis is here. Did that sound like Mavis's horn? No, that was a whistle. Percy's whistle. Thomas will have to look somewhere else. Perhaps Mavis is collecting something at Brendam Docks. Why don't you listen with Thomas again to see if she's here? Did that sound like Mavis's horn? You're right, it was a horn. But not Mavis's horn. It was Salty's horn. Thomas will have to look somewhere else. Maybe Mavis is having a washdown. Listen with Thomas. Did that sound like Mavis's horn? Yes, you're right. That did sound like Mavis's horn. But this doesn't look like Mavis. But only because she was covered in soap suds. Thomas has found Mavis, but he couldn't have done it without your help. Thomas told Mavis all about his plan. Thomas wanted the steam engines and diesel engines to work together. Mavis agreed. Asked Thomas. Said Mavis. Then Thomas had an idea. He puffed. Thomas and Mavis went to see the other engines to tell them all about the meeting. Thomas told Percy, then James, then Emily. Mavis told Diesel, then Harry, then Bert. Soon all the engines on the island knew all about the meeting. All of the engines, except one. Thomas wanted to tell Diesel 10 about the meeting, but as he got closer and closer, Thomas got frightened, and he puffed quickly away. He was sure Diesel 10 would never work with the Steamies anyway. Thomas had told the engines about the meeting, but it had taken a very long time. Thomas was too tired to go back to Emily's sheds. So that night, Thomas slept outside. He pulled slowly into a siding. The forest was dark, but Thomas's lantern shone brightly. Thomas wanted to tell someone about his adventures that day, but he only had an owl for company. Emily wondered where Thomas was. She puffed. Emily was pleased. She had the shed to herself again. But without Thomas, it seemed a little too quiet. She missed hearing all about the day. She even missed the sound of Thomas's sleep whistle. The next morning, all the engines went to the coaling plant. Steamies and diesels came from all over the island to the coaling plant. The coaling plant was very busy. The plant manager was surprised. He wondered. So he went to telephone Sir Topham Hatt. Sir Topham Hatt was sitting down to eat his cream donut. But then the telephone rang. The plant manager told him all about the engines. Said Sir Topham Hatt. The engines were waiting to start the meeting, but Thomas was missing, said Mavis. Thomas was racing through the countryside. He puffed as fast as he could, but he had a long way to go, panted Thomas. The diesel engines didn't want to wait for Thomas, grumbled Harry. Grouched Bert. Percy huffed crossly. This made the diesels cross, said Harry. Thomas finally puffed into the coaling plant. He blew his whistle, and all of the engines went quiet. Chuffed Thomas. Oiled Diesel. Huffed James. Puffed Thomas. All of the engines agreed. They knew that Thomas was right, and they all wanted the airport to open. Then Harold the helicopter arrived. He had brought Sir Topham Hatt to the coaling plant. Sir Topham Hatt asked. Thomas told Sir Topham Hatt all about the meeting. Puffed Thomas. Sir Topham Hatt was delighted. Thomas knows there is a lot to do. But if the steam engines and diesel engines work together, they can get the job done. There are jobs for the engines all over Sodor. Different engines are good at different things. Can you help Thomas decide which steam engine should work with which diesel engine? These workmen need to finish painting the Sodor suspension bridge, but the paint is still at the yard. 2 engines need to go and collect it. The yard has a very tight bend. Mavis is short and can go around tight bends. She needs a short steam engine to help her. Which steam engine do you think should help her? What about Gordon and Henry? Are they short? No, they are very long. Who else could help Mavis? What about Percy? Is he shorter than Gordon? Yes, he is. So he can shunt freight cars around tight bends too. Well done. Percy can help Mavis collect the paint and take it to the workmen. One steam engine and one diesel engine working together. These workmen all need to be taken to the airport. There are lots of them. Toby will need some help. Which diesel engine do you think could help him?
Not you.
What about Ari and Bert? Do they take passengers? No. Ari and Bert are good at shunting, but they don't take passengers. Can you see a diesel engine who does take passengers? Daisy! That's a very good idea. Daisy is a diesel, and she carries passengers. Daisy can help Toby. There goes Toby with some of the workmen. And here's Daisy to take the rest. Another diesel engine and another steam engine are working together. Here's Gordon. His coaches are full of carpenters. He's taking them to repair the engine sheds. But his train is very heavy, and the sheds are on the other side of Gordon's hill. Edward usually helps push Gordon up the hill, but Edward is busy taking supplies. Are there any diesels that could help Gordon? Thomas isn't sure. Which diesels do you think are good at pushing? Do you think Ari and Bert could push Gordon? They've never done it before. But maybe Ari and Bert could push Gordon up Gordon's hill. They've done it. 2 more diesel engines working with a steam engine. All the work is getting done. Steam engines and diesel engines work very well together. Well done, Thomas. And well done, everyone. The airport was soon open. It had shining windows, gleaming doors, and a big tall control tower. And the runway was long and smooth. The engines were very proud and very excited. The first airplane was on its way. But there was still one more job to do. Thomas was shunting some freight cars into the yard. He was taking great care. But the track was bumpy. Suddenly, they started to come off the track. Some of them headed straight for the water.